Close your eyes and let your mind drift to a place where legends are not born from heroism, but forged in the harsh, sun-baked mountains of Sinaloa, a name that would one day echo through the underworld of the entire globe. This is not just a story about a criminal. It is a saga of a man who helped build an empire from the ground up, an architect of a shadow nation whose influence would stretch from the dusty streets of Culiacan to the gleaming skyscrapers of Chicago, a man whose life was a turbulent river of power, love, devastating loss, and ultimate downfall. His name was Héctor Luis Palma Salazar, but to the world he was known as El Héros, the Blonde, a title that belied the immense darkness he would both command and endure. Before we journey into the intricate and often violent details of his life, an essential disclaimer must be laid bare. This narrative is a compilation, a tapestry woven from threads of declassified court documents, testimonies of informants, extensive investigative reports, and historical accounts. The purpose is not to glorify the actions of the Sinaloa Cartel or its founders, but to present a coherent, factual, and deeply engaging account for you, the listener, to understand the complex machinery of power and the human stories that operate within it. This is a story presented for informational and narrative immersion, with the sole intention of bringing a significant, albeit dark, chapter of modern history to life. Now, let us begin at the beginning, in a time when the drug trade was not yet the colossal, industrial-scale enterprise it would become, but a rugged, entrepreneurial endeavor for sons of the soil. Héctor Palma was born on January 4, 1950, in the municipality of Mocorito, Sinaloa, a region where the land was rich but opportunities were scarce. The post-war Mexico of his youth was a country of contrasts, and for many young men like Héctor, the path to a better life was not found in the classroom or the factory, but in the clandestine fields of marijuana and the hidden laboratories of opium gum. It was a trade born of necessity, a risky but lucrative defiance of both poverty and the law. The young Palma, with his light hair and eyes that would later earn him his infamous nickname, was not a standout student, but he possessed a sharp, calculating mind and a quiet ambition that simmered beneath a calm exterior. He learned the ways of the trade not from textbooks, but from the older, seasoned smugglers who navigated the treacherous Sierra Madre Occidental, moving their contraband north towards the insatiable American market. This was his university, and the lessons were harsh, with failure often meaning prison or a bullet. It was in these formative years, navigating this dangerous landscape, that a young Héctor Palma would cross paths with another ambitious and notoriously ruthless young man from La Tuna named Joaquín Archibaldo Guzmán Lyra, the future El Chapo. Their meeting was not a grand, cinematic event, but a convergence of two similar forces, two minds that recognized in each other a complementary set of skills and an unquenchable thirst for more. While Chapo was known for his boldness and almost reckless ambition, Palma was the strategist, the calm and collected operator who preferred to work from the shadows, building alliances, managing logistics, and understanding that money and influence could be just as powerful as violence This partnership, forged in the fires of the early Mexican drug trade, would become the bedrock upon which the entire Sinaloa Cartel would eventually be constructed. They started small, as part of the broader Guadalajara Cartel under the leadership of Miguel Angel Felix Gallardo, but even then, they were students observing their master, learning the intricate web of corruption, trafficking routes, and political protection that would allow a criminal enterprise to flourish. Palma's role grew steadily. He was not just a trafficker, but a networker. He understood that to move vast quantities of drugs, you needed more than mules and pilots. You needed police commanders on your payroll, politicians in your pocket, and a loyal army of sicarios who feared you more than they feared the government. He began to build his own empire within the empire, cultivating a reputation for being ruthless when necessary, but always pragmatic. His rise was not meteoric, but it was steady, relentless, and built on a foundation of calculated decisions and strategic betrayals. The 1980s were a period of immense upheaval and opportunity in the narcotics world. The demand for cocaine in the United States was exploding, and the Colombian cartels, particularly the Medellin cartel of Pablo Escobar, needed reliable partners to move their product through Mexico and into the promised land. Héctor Palma and his partner, Chapo Guzmán, positioned themselves perfectly to become those partners. They offered the Colombians a streamlined, efficient route, leveraging their existing marijuana and opium networks to create a cocaine superhighway. The money that began to flow was unimaginable, some so vast they had to be buried in the desert, stored in secret warehouses, and laundered through countless front businesses. This was the period where El Güero Palma truly came into his own, transforming from a regional smuggler into a transnational criminal CEO. He established key plazas, or territories, securing crucial border crossings and building a sophisticated distribution network across the American Southwest. His power base was in Guadalajara, where he lived a life of paradoxical normality and extreme luxury, a king who could walk among his subjects, yet command a private army. It was during this time of escalating power and wealth that Héctor Palma, the hardened criminal, experienced something he perhaps did not expect. He fell deeply, completely in love. Her name was Guadalupe Ligia Serrano, and she was a beautiful former flight attendant. For a man whose life was steeped in violence and deception, Lupe, as she was known, represented an oasis of purity, normalcy, and unconditional love. He lavished her with everything money could buy, but more importantly, he built a world with her, a sanctuary away from the brutal business of the cartel. They started a family, having children, and for Héctor Palma, this was not just a side project. It was the core of his existence. The man who could order executions with a nod of his head was a doting, devoted husband and father at home. This duality is central to understanding the tragedy that was to come. He had successfully compartmentalized his life, building a wall between the loving family man in his Guadalajara villa and the cold, calculating drug lord who managed $1 billion criminal enterprise. But walls, no matter how well constructed, can never truly separate two worlds that are fundamentally and violently opposed. The love for his family became both his greatest strength and his most profound vulnerability, a hidden fault line running directly through the foundation of his empire, waiting for the right moment to crack it wide open. The golden era for Héctor Palma, the period where his power and personal happiness seemed to be in a perfect, synchronized ascent, was as intoxicating as it was fragile. With his beloved wife, Guadalupe, and their young children, he cultivated a domestic life that was a world away from the brutal realities of his work. Their home was a fortress of love and luxury, a place where the sounds of childhood laughter drowned out the distant echoes of gunfire and betrayal. Palma, the feared El Güero, was within those walls simply a husband and a father, a man who found a sense of peace and purpose that his criminal empire could never provide. This duality required a constant, meticulous performance, a dance on a knife's edge where one misstep could be catastrophic. He shielded his family from the grisly details of his trade, believing that the wealth and security he provided were worth the moral compromises and the ever-present danger. Meanwhile, the business of the cartel continued to expand at a breathtaking pace. The partnership with the Colombians had evolved. Palma and Guzmán were no longer just junior partners providing a transit service. They were powerful lords in their own right, demanding a greater share of the profits and eventually moving to control the entire supply chain, from acquisition in South America to distribution deep within the United States. This ambition inevitably led to conflict, both with their former Colombian overlords and with rival Mexican cartels, most notably the Tijuana cartel, led by the ruthless Arellano Felix brothers. The streets of Guadalajara, once a relatively peaceful hub for the discreet management of the drug trade, began to simmer with tension. The air grew thick with paranoia as alliances shifted like desert sand, and every passing car could be carrying an assassin. It was against this backdrop of escalating violence that Palma made a decision that would, in hindsight, appear to be a desperate attempt to cling to his crumbling normalcy. He planned a family vacation, a brief escape from the pressures of his double life. The destination was Puerto Vallarta, a picturesque resort town on the Pacific coast, a place of sun, sand, and seeming safety. It was meant to be a respite, a few precious days where he could just be Héctor, the family man. In early November of 1987, a private plane was chartered. The details of that day are etched in the annals of cartel history with a chilling clarity. The aircraft, a small, twin-engine model, took off into the bright Mexican sky, carrying not just a drug lord and his family, but the entire fragile equilibrium of Palma's world. On board were his wife Guadalupe, his 2 young children, and several other associates. What happened next remains a subject of some speculation, but the outcome is a matter of grim, historical record. Some accounts suggest mechanical failure, a simple, tragic twist of fate. Others, however, whisper of something more sinister, a bomb planted by his rivals, the Arellano Felix brothers, who saw an opportunity to decapitate a rival organization by eliminating one of its key leaders. The truth of the cause may never be fully known, but the consequence was absolute and horrifying. The plane plummeted from the sky, crashing into the rugged mountains near the town of Tequila, Jalisco. The impact was catastrophic, leaving no survivors. The news reached Héctor Palma not through official channels, but through the panicked, hushed whispers of his subordinates. The man who had built an empire on control found himself utterly powerless in the face of this loss. The image of El Güero, Palma, the stoic and calculating kingpin, arriving at the crash site, is one of profound, gut-wrenching devastation. He stood amidst the smoldering wreckage, the twisted metal and charred earth. That was all that remained of his sanctuary, his reason for being. He reportedly sifted through the debris with his bare hands, a broken figure searching for any remnant of the life he had so carefully built. The emotional destruction was total. The calm, strategic operator was gone, replaced by a man consumed by a grief so profound it bordered on madness. His power, his wealth, his influence, all of it became meaningless, ashes mixed with the ashes of his wife and children. This personal apocalypse did not, however, lead to his immediate downfall in the criminal world. Instead, it transformed him. The loss stripped away the last vestiges of his humanity, leaving behind a raw, unadulterated rage. The man who had once valued strategy and discretion was now a volatile and unpredictable force, driven by a thirst for vengeance that would cloud his judgment and make him reckless. He became convinced that the Arellano F.A. Licks brothers were responsible for the murder of his family, and he dedicated the entirety of his resources and his being to a single goal, their annihilation. This personal war would escalate the already violent conflict between the Sinaloa and Tijuana cartels into a full-blown national crisis, drawing in the Mexican government and forever altering the landscape of the drug trade. The tragedy of the plane crash was not just the death of a family, it was the death of the last restraint holding back a torrent of violence. Palma, in his grief-stricken state, began to make errors. His operations, once models of efficiency and secrecy, became sloppy, driven more by emotion than by cold calculation. He was a ghost of his former self, a man walking through the motions of leadership while his soul remained at that crash site in the mountains of Jalisco. This vulnerability did not go unnoticed by his enemies, nor by the authorities who had been desperately trying to build a case against him for years. The walls were beginning to close in, but Palma, blinded by his grief and his obsession with revenge, seemed almost oblivious to the danger. He was a king presiding over a kingdom that was starting to crack. His throne built on a foundation of sorrow that was slowly, inexorably, turning to quicksand. The reign of El Güero Palma, the co-founder and strategic mind of the Sinaloa Cartel, was entering its final, most dramatic act, an act that would be defined not by his power, but by his profound and catastrophic loss. The aftermath of the plane crash was a seismic event that sent shockwaves through the very foundations of the Sinaloa Cartel, fundamentally altering its trajectory and the psyche of its co-founder. Héctor Palma, now a specter haunted by an unimaginable loss, was no longer the same man who had meticulously built an empire with a calm and strategic hand. The grief that consumed him was a wild, untamable force, and it manifested not as a retreat into solitude, but as a roaring, violent storm aimed squarely at the Arellano F.A. brothers and their Tijuana cartel. This period marked a dangerous escalation in the Mexican drug war, transforming what had been a brutal business rivalry into a deeply personal, blood-soaked feud. Palma's intelligence network, once used to secure drug routes and corrupt officials, was now singularly focused on one objective: locating and exterminating his rivals. He poured millions of dollars into funding assassination squads, offering colossal bounties for the heads of the Arellano F.A. family. This single-minded pursuit made him reckless. Operational security, once his hallmark, became secondary to the goal of vengeance. His movements became more predictable, his communications less guarded, as rage overrode the instinct for self-preservation that had kept him at the top for so long. Meanwhile, the Mexican government, under increasing pressure from the United States, was intensifying its own campaign against the cartels. The brazen violence, particularly the high-profile assassinations and shootouts in major cities like Guadalajara, was an embarrassment to the state and a direct challenge to its authority. Palma, in his grief-stricken and volatile state, had become a prime target. He was no longer the shadowy, elusive figure. He was a beacon of chaos, and the authorities began to close in. The manhunt for El Güero, Palma became one of the highest priorities for Mexico's elite anti-narcotics units, who were now receiving sophisticated intelligence and training from American agencies like the DEA. They began to systematically dismantle his organization, picking off his lieutenants one by one, seizing his assets, and turning his closest associates into informants. The very structure he had built so carefully was now being used against him, as each arrested underling represented a potential leak, a crack in his armor. Palma found himself navigating a landscape that had grown increasingly hostile, not just from his rivals in Tijuana, but from the full force of the state. He was a king trapped in his own castle, the walls crumbling around him. His life became a nomadic existence, moving between safe houses in and around Guadalajara, never staying in one place for more than a few nights. His sleep haunted by the ghosts of his family and the living threat of his enemies. The pressure was immense, a constant, grinding weight that would have broken a lesser man long before. Yet, Palma endured, driven by a mixture of sheer will and a burning desire for revenge that was the only thing keeping him alive. It was during this period of intense pressure that the legend of his partnership with Joaquín, El Chapo, Guzmán was tested. While both were targeted by the same forces, their responses began to diverge. Chapo, ever the survivalist, was adapting, finding new routes, new methods, and consolidating his own power base within the cartel. The tragedy that had befallen Palma had, in a cold, strategic sense, weakened his position, and in the ruthless world they inhabited, weakness was an opportunity. The once inseparable partners began to operate with more independence, their fates starting to unravel along different paths. The net was finally drawn tight in the early summer of 1995. After months of surveillance and intelligence gathering, Mexican federal agents, acting on a tip from a turned cartel insider, located one of Palma's primary safe houses in an upscale neighborhood of Guadalajara. The operation to capture him was planned with military precision, aware that they were targeting one of the most powerful and dangerous men in the country, a man with a small army of bodyguards at his disposal. On the morning of June 23, 1995, the quiet of the residential street was shattered by the roar of engines and the shouts of heavily armed commandos. A fierce firefight erupted as Palma's security detail, caught by surprise but fiercely loyal, attempted to repel the assault. The battle was short, brutal, and bloody. When the smoke cleared, several of Palma's men lay dead, but the primary target had been secured. Héctor Luis Palma Salazar, the legendary El Güero, the co-founder of the Sinaloa Cartel, the man who had lost everything and waged a private war, was finally in handcuffs. His arrest was hailed as a monumental victory for the Mexican government, a symbol that no cartel leader was beyond the reach of the law. For Palma, however, the arrest was almost an anticlimax. The real battle, the emotional one, had been lost years before on a mountainside near Tequila. As he was led away, the stoic mask he had worn for so long likely did little to hide the emptiness in his eyes. He was a prisoner now, but in many ways he had been a prisoner of his own grief and rage since the day his family died. His capture marked the end of an era, the definitive fall of one of the original architects of the modern Mexican drug trade. He was transported to the maximum security Federal Social Readaptation Center No. 1, known as Almoloya or Il Altiplano, a fortress designed to hold the nation's most notorious criminals. Behind its imposing walls and layers of concrete and steel, the kingpin was stripped of his power, his wealth, and his freedom. He was now just another inmate, a number in the system, forced to confront the consequences of his life's work in the cold, sterile environment of a prison cell. The world outside, the world he had helped shape through violence and ambition, would continue to spin without him. But for Héctor Palma, the journey was far from over. His story was now transitioning from one of power and revenge to one of legal battles, imprisonment, and a long, slow reckoning with the legacy he had created. The clanging of the prison door behind Héctor Palma was not merely the end of his freedom. It was the beginning of a new, protracted struggle. A battle fought not with guns in the streets, but with legal briefs in courtrooms and a desperate, clandestine effort to maintain a shred of his former influence from within the belly of the beast. His incarceration in the Altiplano prison was intended to be the final chapter, a permanent neutralization of a major threat to the state. However, for a man of Palma's resources and cunning, prison walls were an obstacle to be managed, not a definitive end. The Mexican government, flush with the victory of his capture, immediately began building an extensive case for a long-term conviction, compiling evidence from seized documents, intercepted communications, and the testimonies of lower-level cartel members who had been flipped by prosecutors. Palma, understanding the gravity of his situation, assembled a formidable legal team. Funded by the vast fortunes he had hidden away in complex webs of front companies and secret accounts, his life now became a dual existence, the public inmate, subject to the rigid routines and deprivations of prison life, and the shadowy kingpin, who could still, through a network of corrupt guards and loyal lawyers, send messages and issue orders to what remained of his organization on the outside. This period was marked by a strange duality for the Sinaloa Cartel as a whole. With Palma behind bars, the balance of power shifted decisively to Joaquín, El Chapo, Guzmán, who now assumed undisputed leadership, steering the organization through the turbulent waters of the late 1990s and early 2000s. Yet, Palma's legacy was deeply embedded in the cartel's DNA, the logistical networks he built, the corruption schemes he established, and the strategic alliances he forged continued to function, a testament to the robust system he had helped create. From his cell, Palma watched as the empire he co-founded grew even more powerful and profitable, a bitter reality for a man who could no longer directly partake in its operations or enjoy its immense spoils. His primary focus shifted to his own survival, both legal and physical. The prison system in Mexico was, and remains, a notoriously dangerous place for high-profile narcos, where rival gangs coexist in a tense, often violent equilibrium, and hits can be ordered from the outside with chilling ease. Palma, aware that the Arellano F.A. Licks brothers would not rest simply because he was imprisoned, had to constantly watch his back, relying on a contingent of loyal men who had been incarcerated with him or whom he had bribed for protection. The legal proceedings against him were slow and complex, a labyrinth of motions, appeals, and evidentiary hearings. He faced a multitude of charges, including drug trafficking, organized crime, arms possession, and multiple counts of murder. The prosecution's case was strong, but Palma's lawyers fought tenaciously, challenging the legality of his arrest, the provenance of evidence, and the credibility of witnesses. This period of legal limbo stretched for years, a monotonous and draining war of attrition that stood in stark contrast to the high-octane life of violence and power he had once led. It was during these years of imprisonment that the man, stripped of his external power, was forced to confront himself. The all-consuming rage that had defined him after his family's death had, over time, likely mellowed into a more profound, lingering sorrow. The endless hours in a cell provided ample time for reflection, for replaying the moments of his life, from his humble beginnings in Sinaloa to the pinnacle of his power, and the devastating crash that ended it all. He was a living legend in the criminal underworld, but in that cell, he was just a man alone with his memories and his regrets. The Mexican government, for its part, considered him securely contained, a trophy in their fight against the cartels. However, the nature of the drug war was changing. The fall of one kingpin simply created a power vacuum that was quickly filled by another, often leading to even greater violence as new factions fought for control. The arrest of Palma did not stem the tide of drugs flowing into the United States. It merely redirected the flow through different channels, most of which were still controlled by his former partner, El Chapo. The authorities soon realized that incarcerating a leader was not enough. They had to dismantle the entire financial and logistical infrastructure, a task of Herculean complexity. For Palma, the world was shrinking. News from the outside was filtered and delayed. The cartel he helped build was evolving, adapting to new pressures, and his own relevance within it was gradually fading with each passing year. He was becoming a historical figure, a name from the past, while a new generation of narcos rose to prominence. Yet, his story was far from over. A new and even more formidable challenge was on the horizon, one that would ultimately define the final chapter of his life of conflict. The United States government, which had long viewed Palma as a principal supplier of the narcotics flooding its cities, was preparing its own case against him. They wanted extradition, a prospect that struck fear into the heart of every Mexican drug lord. A trial in the United States meant a different kind of justice, one with longer sentences, higher conviction rates, and prisons from which there was virtually no hope of escape or maintaining influence. The shadow of American justice began to loom over Palma's already confined existence, promising a final, permanent end to his story in a cold, distant cell far from the sun-baked mountains of his homeland. The looming specter of extradition to the United States fundamentally altered the calculus of Héctor Palma's existence within the Mexican prison system. For years, his legal battles had been a complex chess match played on a familiar, if corruptible, board, the Mexican judicial system. He understood its rhythms, its vulnerabilities, and the price of influence within it. The prospect of being sent north, however, represented a checkmate he was desperate to avoid. The United States Department of Justice had been building a sprawling case against him, one that wove together evidence from massive drug seizures, electronic surveillance, and the testimonies of high-value informants who had once been his closest allies. The charges he faced in American courtrooms carried mandatory minimum sentences that effectively meant life imprisonment without parole. In a penal system notorious for its harsh conditions and absolute isolation for high-profile criminals, this external pressure created a paradoxical situation inside Altiplano. While on one hand, Palma was a diminished figure, his power waning with each passing year of confinement. The American desire for him ironically reaffirmed his legendary status. He was a prized asset, a symbol of the cross-border nature of the drug war, and his eventual fate would be a significant political token in the often fraught relationship between Mexico and the United States. This period saw a frantic intensification of his legal maneuvers. His team of lawyers filed a barrage of appeals and injunctions, challenging the extradition treaty itself and arguing that he could not receive a fair trial in the U.S. due to the prejudicial media coverage and the political pressure on American prosecutors to secure a conviction. Simultaneously, the remnants of his network on the outside worked to leverage any remaining political connections, to lobby against his transfer, a murky process involving bribes, promises, and threats It was a war fought on two fronts: the public, transparent battlefield of the law, and the shadowy, clandestine world of back-channel negotiations and corruption. Yet, the tide of history was against him. The early 2000s saw a significant shift in Mexico's approach to the drug war, particularly under the administration of President Vicente Fox, who took office in 2000, ending 7 decades of one-party rule. Fox's government, seeking to demonstrate a new era of accountability and cooperation with the United States, made the extradition of high-level drug traffickers a cornerstone of its security policy. This political will at the highest level made Palma's position increasingly precarious. The back doors that might have once been open were now being systematically closed. Inside the prison, life continued its grim routine, but the anxiety was palpable. Every procedural hearing, every official visit, could be the prelude to the moment when he would be forcibly removed from his cell, shackled, and put on a plane to face an unknown and terrifying future. He watched as other cartel figures were successfully extradited, their stories effectively ending as they disappeared into the American prison system, their names soon forgotten by all but the most dedicated narcophiles and federal agents. Palma was determined not to become just another statistic. His mind, once focused on global logistics and violent feuds, was now entirely concentrated on this single objective: remaining in Mexico. It was a defensive, holding action, a far cry from the ambitious empire building of his past. During these years, his connection to the operational side of the Sinaloa Cartel became almost entirely severed. El Chapo Guzmán, who himself was navigating his own imprisonment and would eventually pull off a legendary escape in 2001, was running a global enterprise that had long outgrown its original founders. The cartel was now a multinational corporation, and Palma was a retired, albeit imprisoned, co-founder with no say in its daily operations or strategic direction. This isolation must have been a profound psychological blow, a final acknowledgement that the world he helped create had moved on without him. He was a relic, a living monument to a bygone era of the drug trade, now forced to confront the consequences of his actions, not through the prism of power, but through the slow, grinding machinery of international law. The Mexican government, for its part, was in no rush. Holding Palma was a strategic asset. His eventual extradition was a card to be played at the most opportune time to secure greater cooperation or concessions from Washington. So he waited, trapped in a state of legal and personal limbo, a king in a cage, his fate a subject of diplomatic negotiation. The fierce, grieving, vengeful man of the past seemed to have been worn down by the relentless passage of time and the sheer inertia of the system, replaced by a more resigned, calculating figure who understood that his final battle would not be fought with weapons, but with legal technicalities and the shifting winds of international politics. The question was no longer if he would fall, but where he would spend the rest of his days. A subtle but critical distinction that defined the last vestiges of his struggle for agency in a life that had long since spiraled out of his control. The legal and political stalemate surrounding Héctor Palma's extradition stretched across years. A protracted twilight that saw the world outside his prison walls transform in ways he could only dimly perceive. The new millennium ushered in an era of unprecedented violence in Mexico, a direct consequence of the state's intensified campaign against the cartels and the resulting power vacuums. The Sinaloa Cartel, under the resilient and ever elusive leadership of El Chapo Guzmán, was engaged in a brutal war on multiple fronts against the Mexican state, against the resurgent Gulf Cartel and their paramilitary enforcers, the Zetas, and against the lingering threat from the Tijuana Cartel. This was a conflict of a scale and savagery that dwarfed the battles of Palma's heyday, featuring mass graves, beheadings, and the widespread militarization of the drug trade. From his cell, Palma would have heard echoes of this carnage, a grim testament to the monster he had helped birth, now running amok without its original architects to steer it. This period of enforced isolation forced upon him a unique, albeit limited, perspective. He was both a cause of the chaos and a spectator to it, insulated from the immediate danger, but utterly powerless to influence the tidal wave of violence he had helped set in motion decades earlier. His own legal situation remained in a state of suspended animation. The Mexican courts became a battleground where his fate was debated in a complex tangle of procedural motions. His lawyers exploited every possible avenue, challenging the validity of evidence, the credibility of witnesses, and the very legality of the extradition request under Mexican constitutional law. They argued that the crimes he was accused of in the United States were the same as those for which he was already serving a sentence in Mexico, and that to send him north would constitute double jeopardy. They painted a picture of a man who had already been punished, who had been stripped of his power and his family, and who deserved to serve his time in his homeland. The prosecution, backed by the immense political will of the Fox administration and the relentless pressure from American agencies, presented him as a foundational pillar of an ongoing criminal enterprise that continued to flood the United States with poison and violence, arguing that only a definitive conviction in a U.S. court could provide true justice and closure. This legal ping-pong created a strange existence for Palma. He was neither fully in the Mexican system, as the threat of removal constantly hung over him, nor was he in the American system, which eagerly awaited his arrival. He was in a purgatorial state, a man caught between two nations, two justice systems, and two very different visions of his legacy. During this time, his health began to show signs of decline. The cumulative stress of a life of violence, the catastrophic emotional trauma of his family's death, and the harsh conditions of long-term incarceration started to take a physical toll. Reports and rumors, difficult to verify but persistent, spoke of hypertension, heart problems, and the general deterioration common among long-term prisoners. The once feared El Güero, known for his calm authority and sharp mind, was becoming an aging, ailing man. His identity was slowly being stripped away, layer by layer, first his family, then his freedom, then his power, and now his health. The world of narcocorridos, the folk ballads that immortalized drug lords, still sang of his exploits, but the man himself was fading, a shadow confined to a small, concrete room. The Mexican government, meanwhile, was achieving significant successes in its extradition policy. Other high-value targets were being sent north, setting legal precedents and strengthening the bilateral cooperation that made Palma's own position increasingly untenable. Each successful extradition was a nail in the coffin of his defense, a clear signal that the political barriers he relied on were crumbling. He was running out of time and out of options. The intricate web of legal defenses his team had woven was being slowly and methodically unpicked by the persistent efforts of prosecutors and diplomats. The final appeal was denied, the last injunction overturned. The order for his extradition was finally signed, sealed, and delivered. The date was set. The years of waiting, of legal wrangling and shadowy negotiations were over. The outcome he had fought so desperately to avoid was now imminent. The news would have been delivered to him in a sterile, bureaucratic manner, a simple notification that shattered the fragile routine of his existence. The king of the Sierra Madre, the co-founder of an empire, was to be handed over to a foreign power, a final, humiliating capitulation. The moment of transfer, when it finally came, was likely a stark and clinical affair. He would have been removed from his cell in the dead of night or in the early morning hours, a security protocol to minimize risk. He was shackled hand and foot, surrounded by a heavily armed contingent of federal police or military personnel. There would be no farewells, no last looks at the Mexican landscape he had once dominated. He was loaded into an armored vehicle, transported to a military airfield, and handed over to American marshals or DEA agents. The flight to the United States was the final, physical crossing of a line from which there was no return. As the plane ascended, leaving Mexican airspace, it carried not just a prisoner, but the end of an era. Héctor Palma was now a commodity, a piece of evidence, a trophy of war. On his way to face a justice system that had been waiting for him for over a decade. The transition from a Mexican prison to the custody of the United States government was a jarring, existential shift that stripped Héctor Palma of the last vestiges of his identity and control. The flight north was not merely a change of location, it was a journey into a different universe of justice, one defined by an impersonal, relentless efficiency that was far removed from the corruptible, human scale systems of his homeland. Upon landing on American soil, likely at a secure military airbase, the procedures were immediate and dehumanizing. He was processed by U.S. Marshals, his fingerprints and photographs taken anew, entering him into a federal database as just another number in a vast, faceless system. The language barrier alone created a profound isolation. The commands, the legal jargon, the very sounds of his new reality were foreign, reinforcing his status as an outsider, a captive in a land whose culture and laws he had flouted for decades, but never truly experienced. He was then transported to a federal detention center, most probably in New York or Texas, where the cases against him were centralized to await his arraignment and trial. This facility was a world away from Altiplano. The conditions, while not luxurious, were starkly different, cleaner, more technologically advanced, and governed by an inflexible rule of law that offered no room for the bribes or influence that could sometimes ease life in a Mexican prison. He was placed in a special housing unit, essentially solitary confinement, a standard practice for high-profile, high-risk inmates considered flight risks or potential targets. His world shrank to the dimensions of a single cell, with minimal human contact, monitored by cameras, and his movements restricted to a few hours of solitary recreation in a caged yard. This sensory deprivation was a psychological weapon in itself, forcing a man accustomed to command and action into a state of profound stillness and introspection. The preparation for his trial became the new central drama of his life. His American court, appointed attorneys, or a privately hired team funded by whatever hidden assets he could still access, would have met with him to build a defense. The evidence against him was mountainous and meticulously organized. The United States government, having pursued him for so long, had constructed a narrative not just of a drug trafficker, but of a CEO of a criminal corporation. The indictment detailed specific shipments of tons of cocaine and heroin, money laundering operations spanning multiple continents, and a pattern of racketeering that painted a picture of a sophisticated, violent criminal enterprise. The prosecutors were armed with cooperators, former pilots, money launderers, cartel lieutenants, and even former associates from the early days of the Guadalajara cartel, who were ready to testify against him in exchange for reduced sentences. For Palma, this was a new kind of betrayal, one conducted under the bright lights of an American courtroom, with a court reporter transcribing every word. The defense strategy was likely limited, focusing not on proving innocence, but on mitigating the sentence. They would have argued that he was a man from a different time, that he had already been punished severely by the loss of his family and his long imprisonment in Mexico, and that the cartel had evolved far beyond his influence. They might have attempted to challenge the credibility of the cooperators, painting them as self-serving criminals who would say anything to save themselves. But the legal momentum was overwhelmingly against him. The American judicial machine, once set in motion, is a formidable force, and Palma was just one of countless kingpins it had successfully processed. The pre-trial hearings were a masterclass in a system he could not manipulate. The rules of evidence were strictly enforced, the judge was impartial and unapproachable, and the entire process was transparent and recorded, leaving no dark corners in which a deal could be struck. For a man like Palma, this level playing field was his greatest disadvantage. His power had always resided in the shadows, in his ability to leverage fear and money to bend situations to his will. Here, in this sterile courtroom, his wealth was frozen, his threats were meaningless, and his legend held no sway. He was just the defendant, and the full, awesome weight of the state was bearing down upon him. The reality of his situation must have crystallized during these proceedings. There would be no escape. No last-minute pardon, no dramatic rescue. The only certainty was a life sentence in an American supermax prison. A fate considered by many to be a living death, a final, permanent erasure from the world. The trial itself, if it even proceeded to a full jury, would have been a formality, a ritualistic confirmation of a foregone conclusion. Faced with the inevitability of a devastating conviction, the pragmatic choice, the last strategic decision available to him, was to plead guilty. By accepting responsibility, he could avoid the spectacle of a trial and the potential for even more severe sentencing. The plea bargain was the final negotiation of his life, the last time he would have any agency over his destiny. He stood before a federal judge, and in a language that was not his own, or through an interpreter, he admitted to the crimes that had defined his existence. The judge would have asked him a series of procedural questions, ensuring he understood the rights he was waiving and the consequences of his plea. And then, with the strike of a gavel, it was over. Héctor Luis Palma Salazar, il Güero, was no longer a defendant. He was a convicted felon, sentenced to spend the remainder of his natural life in a cage thousands of miles from the Sinaloan soil that had created him. The king was dead. Long live the inmate. The finality of his guilty plea and the subsequent life sentence imposed by the American court marked the absolute and irrevocable end of Héctor Palma's journey as an active player on the world stage, reducing his existence to the stark, monotonous rhythm of the American penal system. His transfer to a permanent federal prison, most likely a high-security facility like the United States Penitentiary, Administrative Maximum Facility in Florence, Colorado, infamously known as ADX Florence, or the Alcatraz of the Rockies, was the last move in a game he had decisively lost. ADX Florence is not merely a prison, it is a monument to human isolation. Engineered to house the most dangerous inmates in the federal system, those deemed to require the highest level of control. Upon his arrival, Palma would have undergone an intensive processing designed to systematically erase any remnant of his individual identity. He was assigned a number, issued a standard, khaki uniform, and subjected to a dehumanizing series of searches and evaluations. His new home was a concrete cell, approximately 7 by 12 feet, equipped with a fixed concrete desk and bed, a stainless steel sink and toilet, and a narrow slit of a window that offered a fragmented, abstract view of the sky or the prison walls. All meals were delivered through a slot in the solid steel door, and his 1 hour of daily recreation was spent alone in a small, concrete, walled cage open to the sky, a space colloquially known as the dog run. Human contact was minimal and strictly controlled. Interactions with guards were perfunctory and monitored, and communication with other inmates was virtually impossible, designed out of the facility's very architecture. For a man like Palma, whose power was once built on his network of personal relationships, his ability to command loyalty, and his strategic conversations, this sensory and social deprivation was a punishment far beyond the mere loss of liberty. It was a cognitive and psychological tomb. The relentless silence of his environment, broken only by the distant, echoing sounds of other sealed doors, and the occasional intercom stood in stark contrast to the vibrant, chaotic, and often violent soundscape of his former life in Sinaloa and Guadalajara. Here, there was no one to command, no deals to negotiate, no rivals to outmaneuver. There was only time, an endless, unbroken river of it, stretching out before him until his death. His days would have followed an unchanging routine: wake up, receive a meal, pace the few steps his cell allowed, perhaps read a book if he could obtain one, watch a small, secured television that offered limited, pre-approved channels, and then try to sleep, only to repeat the cycle the next day. The fierce, grieving, ambitious man who had once shaped history was now a ghost in the machine, a data point in the Bureau of Prisons database. His health, which had begun to decline in Mexico, would have continued its slow deterioration under the stresses of extreme confinement and advancing age. The emotional toll of this existence is unimaginable. Any news from the outside world about the ongoing cartel wars, the fortunes and falls of his former associates, the death or capture of his old partner, El Chapo, would have reached him filtered, delayed, and stripped of context, mere echoes of a life he could no longer touch. He was a living relic, a museum piece of the drug war, while outside, the organization he helped found continued to adapt, fragment, and evolve, its leadership passing to a new generation that likely knew his name only as a legend from a bygone era. The Sinaloa Cartel, even after the eventual recapture and extradition of Joaquín Guzmán himself, remained a powerful force, proving that the system Palma helped build was larger than any single individual, even its founders. In his concrete solitude, Palma was forced to confront this legacy not as a king, but as a prisoner. The empire he constructed for wealth and power had ultimately become his own eternal cage. The love for his family, which had been the catalyst for his downfall, was now a distant, painful memory. Perhaps the only human emotion that remained untainted by the brutal reality of his life's work. There were no more battles to fight, no more appeals to file, no more enemies to vanquish. His story, for all intents and purposes, was over. The world had moved on, and Héctor Güero Palma was now a permanent resident of a gray, silent world of his own making, a final, profound irony for a man whose life had been defined by such explosive sound and color. His existence served as a grim lesson, a postscript to a life of extreme ambition, demonstrating that in the end, no amount of wealth or power can purchase freedom from the consequences of one's actions, and that the most impregnable prison is not one made of concrete and steel, but one built from the choices of a lifetime. The profound and unending silence of the supermax prison became the new canvas upon which the remnants of Héctor Palma's consciousness were projected, a vast, empty space where the echoes of his past life reverberated with a painful, inescapable clarity. In the absence of external stimuli, his mind became his only landscape, and it was a terrain haunted by ghosts. The memories he had spent years suppressing in the chaotic aftermath of his family's death now returned with a vengeance. Unbidden and in high definition, he would recall not just the grand, cinematic moments of power, the private jets landing on clandestine airstrips, the suitcases overflowing with cash, the respectful fear in the eyes of his subordinates, but also the small, intimate details of the life he had lost. The sound of his children's laughter, echoing through the halls of his Guadalajara villa, the scent of his wife Guadalupe's perfume, the warmth of the Sinaloan sun on his face during a rare, peaceful moment at his ranch. These memories, once a source of comfort, were now instruments of torture, reminding him of a paradise he had single-handedly obliterated through the choices he had made. He would inevitably replay the sequence of events leading to the plane crash, a torturous loop of what-if scenarios. What if he had not been a high-profile target? What if he had chosen a different destination? What if he had taken a different plane? The question of whether it was a simple accident or a bomb planted by his rivals would have gnawed at him. A mystery with no answer, a wound that could never heal. This internal torment was the true life sentence, a punishment far more severe than any the justice system could design. The man who had once commanded armies of sicarios was now powerless against the invasion of his own thoughts. The calculated risks of his criminal career, which he had always assessed with a cool head, now seemed like a monstrous folly. The wealth he had amassed was meaningless. Numbers in frozen accounts he would never access. The power he had wielded was an illusion, proven by the fact that he now lived at the absolute mercy of his captors. His legacy was not one of a romanticized bandido, as the narcocorridos sometimes portrayed, but of a man whose actions had contributed to rivers of blood, broken families, and communities ravaged by addiction and violence. The sheer scale of the devastation caused by the drug trade, which he had once viewed through the narrow lens of business and profit, now likely presented itself to him in its full, horrifying scope. He was just one cog in a vast, destructive machine, but he was a foundational cog, and the weight of that responsibility, ignored for so long, now settled upon him in the oppressive silence of his cell. His existence became a case study in the consequences of a life lived without regard for moral boundaries. The very traits that had propelled him to the top, ruthlessness, ambition, a talent for organization and corruption, were the same traits that had engineered his ultimate destruction. The duality he had once maintained, the loving family man and the ruthless drug lord, had collapsed, revealing that the two could not coexist. The darkness had inevitably consumed the light. In his isolation, he may have also reflected on his former partner, El Chapo, whose own story continued to unfold with dramatic escapes and recaptures, eventually leading to his own extradition and life sentence in the same American prison system. Any sense of camaraderie or shared history would have been tempered by the understanding that their partnership had set them both on this inescapable collision course with destiny. There was no honor among these thieves, only a shared path to ruin. The passage of time inside ADX Florence is not measured in days and years, but in the gradual decay of the body and the spirit. Palma's physical health would have continued to decline. The ailments of age compounded by the psychological stress of solitary confinement. The robust man from the mountains of Sinaloa was now an old, frail inmate, requiring medical attention that, while provided, was delivered with the same clinical detachment as his meals. He became a ghost in the system, a name on a roster, his once formidable presence reduced to a statistic in a medical file. The world outside, the one he had helped shape, continued its relentless march forward. New cartels rose, new leaders emerged, and the drug war entered new, even more complex phases. But for Héctor Palma, time had stopped. He was preserved in the amber of his punishment, a permanent resident of a timeless, silent present, forced to live out his days with the ghosts of his past, a king in a kingdom of one, ruling over nothing but his own regrets in a throne room made of concrete and regret. The unyielding passage of time within the sterile, sound-dampened walls of the Supermax facility wrought a slow but inevitable transformation upon Héctor Palma, not toward redemption, but toward a state of profound resignation and existential acceptance. The fiery rage that had once defined him after his family's death, the ambitious drive that built an empire, and the strategic cunning that kept him alive through decades of war. All these facets of his identity were gradually sanded down by the relentless, monotonous grind of institutionalized life. He was becoming a ghost in his own body, a shell of the man known as El Güero. The outside world, which once hung on his every move, now forgot him. His name occasionally surfaced in academic papers on the drug trade, in documentaries about the rise of the Sinaloa Cartel, or in the sentencing memorandums of newer, younger narcos whose careers were built upon the foundations he laid. But in the public consciousness, he was a figure from a distant past, eclipsed by the more flamboyant and recently captured El Chapo. This obscurity was perhaps a final, strange mercy. There were no more journalists seeking interviews, no more rival hit squads plotting his death, no more law enforcement agencies building new cases. The chaos he had both created and inhabited had finally receded, leaving him in a state of perpetual, eerie calm. His existence was now governed by the strict, unchangeable schedule of the Bureau of Prisons. The clang of the meal slot, the hourly checks by guards through the reinforced window in his door, the single hour of solitary recreation. This routine, once a source of torment, may have eventually become a strange comfort, the only structure left in a life stripped of all other meaning. His health continued to be a primary concern. The robust constitution that had served him well in the rugged Sierras and the stressful life of a fugitive was now succumbing to the ailments of old age and the documented physical decline associated with long-term solitary confinement. He likely suffered from ailments common to incarcerated elderly men's arthritis, cardiovascular issues, diabetes, and the slow erosion of his eyesight and hearing. Medical care in such facilities is competent but impersonal, focused on maintaining life rather than ensuring quality of life. He would be treated by doctors who saw him not as a legendary kingpin, but as a patient number, a collection of symptoms to be managed. The psychological literature on prolonged isolation suggests that inmates often develop coping mechanisms: intense fantasy lives, rigorous exercise routines, deep immersion in religion or books. It is impossible to know which, if any, of these paths Palma took. Did he retreat entirely into the past, reliving his moments of power and love with a vividness that made the present disappear? Or did he attempt to deaden his mind entirely, to become a blank slate, to avoid the pain of memory altogether? Perhaps he found some solace in religion, a common turn for those facing eternity behind bars, seeking a forgiveness from a higher power that the earthly world would never grant him. His connection to any remaining family in Mexico would have been tenuous at best, filtered through lawyers and restricted by stringent prison communication policies. Any children or relatives who survived would have been forced to live in the long shadow of his name, a burden and a danger he could no longer shield them from. The empire he built for them had become their curse, and his inability to protect or provide for them from his concrete tomb would have been a source of deep, silent shame. In this final stage of his life, the narrative of Héctor Luis Palma Salazar was complete. The arc had been drawn from the ambitious young man in Mocorito to the powerful partner of El Chapo, to the grieving widower, to the vengeful target, to the captured prize, and finally, to the forgotten inmate. His story serves as a dark, modern parable about the ultimate futility of a life dedicated to illicit power. It demonstrates that no amount of wealth can insulate a person from profound personal loss, and that no fortress is impregnable forever. The very American prison system that now held him was, in a way, the ultimate expression of the market forces he had so successfully exploited. It was a cold, efficient, and unforgiving enterprise, and he was its product. He had spent his life trafficking in commodities that promised escape and pleasure, and he ended his life in an institution designed to impose the ultimate reality and deprivation. The circle was closed, the irony complete. The man who had lived a life of extreme action was now condemned to a state of absolute passivity, a spectator to his own slow dissolution, a permanent resident of a world where the only thing left to conquer was the next breath and the next, until there were no more. As the years bled into one another within the hermetic seal of his confinement, Héctor Palma's existence transcended mere punishment and entered a realm of profound metaphysical isolation, where the very concepts of past and present began to blur into a continuous, gray haze. The man who had once dictated the flow of narcotics across continents now had no control over the most basic elements of his life. The temperature of his cell, the timing of his meals, the quality of the air he breathed. This absolute loss of agency was the final, masterful stroke of his sentence, a systematic deconstruction of the self that was far more effective than any physical torture. The outside world, with its roaring cacophony of cartel wars, political shifts, and cultural revolutions, became an abstract concept, a faint rumor from a distant galaxy. News, when it filtered in, was stale and fragmented, often received months after the fact. He might have learned of the death of old rivals, or the arrest of former associates with a detached, historical curiosity, as if reading about events that occurred a century ago. The dramatic recapture of his former partner, Joaquín Chapo Guzmán, in 2016, and his subsequent extradition and trial in New York would have been a particularly poignant echo from his past. The media circus surrounding El Chapo's trial, the detailed testimonies that mirrored his own crimes, and the eventual life sentence handed down to his old friend and rival, served as a stark mirror of his own fate, a confirmation that the path they had chosen together only led to one inescapable destination. Yet, even this monumental event would have felt distant, a story about someone he used to know, a character from a book he had read long ago. His own identity was caught in a state of flux. To the guards, he was inmate number, a frail old man who required medical escorts and followed orders without complaint. To the few in the intelligence community who still tracked him, he was a closed file, a source of historical data with no current intelligence value. To the new generation of cartel members, he was a myth, a name from the founding era, like a gangster from the Prohibition times. His reality faded into legend. But who was he to himself? The persona of El Güero, the feared and respected drug lord, had been dismantled by the relentless machinery of American justice. The identity of Héctor, the devoted husband and father, had been annihilated in a fiery crash decades prior. What remained was a consciousness adrift in a sterile sea, a collection of memories without a person to anchor them. His physical world was reduced to the precise dimensions of his cell, a space he knew better than the lines on his own hands. Every scratch on the wall, every chip in the concrete, every stain on the floor was a landmark in his tiny, static universe. He likely developed rituals to mark the passage of time, certain exercises at certain hours, a specific way of folding his clothes, a meticulous method of reading whatever materials he was allowed. These small, self-imposed routines were the last vestiges of his will, a desperate attempt to impose order on the chaos of endless, identical days. The question of remorse is a complex one when applied to a man in such extreme circumstances. It is unlikely he felt remorse in a conventional, moral sense. The conditioning of a life of crime and the narcissism required to believe one is above the law do not easily give way to heartfelt apologies. His regrets were likely more personal and selfish, regret for the specific decisions that led to his capture, regret for the loss of his family, regret for trusting the wrong people. He may have mourned the life he could have had, the legitimate businessman he might have become, the grandchildren he would never meet. But the countless lives destroyed by the drugs he trafficked, the communities torn apart by the violence he funded, the corruption he sowed, these were likely abstract statistics. The collateral damage of a war he saw himself as fighting. In his mind, he was a soldier, a businessman, a provider. To admit the full scope of the devastation he caused would be to admit that his entire life, his entire struggle, was a monstrous error, a psychological collapse that few humans are equipped to face. So he lived on, a sphinx in a concrete tomb, the answers to the great questions of his life and legacy locked away with him. slowly being erased by the sands of time. He became a living monument not to his power, but to the absolute power of the state to neutralize and erase even the most formidable of its adversaries. A permanent resident of a silent, gray world where the only victory left was survival itself. A battle he continued to wage, one breath at a time, against the inevitable. The world outside the impregnable walls of ADX Florence continued its relentless evolution, a stark contrast to the frozen stasis of Héctor Palma's existence. The new decade brought with it seismic shifts in the very nature of the drug trade that he and Guzmán had pioneered. The Sinaloa Cartel, now a decentralized federation of factions often warring with each other, faced fierce competition from the Jalisco Cartel New Generation, CJ&G, a tech-savvy, exceptionally violent organization that mirrored the Sinaloa Cartel's rise, but with a 21st century ruthlessness. The battles were no longer just for smuggling routes, but for cyber territory, using social media for propaganda and terror, and exploiting global financial systems with a sophistication that made Palma's era of buried cash and Hawala networks seem almost quaint. The political landscape in Mexico also transformed, with governments oscillating between confrontational and conciliatory approaches, a debate that Palma's own capture and extradition had helped to fuel. In the United States, the public conversation around drugs began a slow pivot, with a growing number of states legalizing marijuana, a substance that had been one of the foundational crops of his early career. The opioid crisis, fueled by prescription pills and synthetic fentanyl, created a new, even more deadly wave of addiction, a grim legacy of the demand that empires like his were built upon. All of these developments would have reached Palma, if at all, as distorted, fragmented echoes. A newspaper article left in his cell, a snippet of news on his secured television, a comment from a guard. These were his tenuous links to a reality that was moving forward without him. He was like a specimen preserved in amber, a perfect snapshot of a specific period in the drug war, while the world outside the lab window changed beyond recognition. His own health became the central drama of his life. The minor ailments of his earlier incarceration escalated into serious, chronic conditions. The heart that had pumped adrenaline through his body during daring escapes and violent confrontations was now a frail muscle requiring medication and monitoring. His joints, once strong from navigating the rugged Sierras, were now stiff with arthritis. His eyesight, which had once scanned the horizon for threats and opportunities, began to fail, making reading difficult and turning his already limited world even blurrier and more confined. The prison medical staff treated him with professional detachment, their goal to maintain his life, not to nurture his spirit. He was a complex patient file, a collection of deteriorating systems. The vibrant, charismatic man from the old photographs was now a ghost in the prison's infirmary, a frail figure being shuffled to and from appointments in a wheelchair, his wrists and ankles shackled even as he received an EKG or a blood test. This physical decline was accompanied by a final, subtle shift in his relationship with his own past. The sharp, painful edges of his memories, The visceral grief for his family, the burning rage for his rivals, likely began to soften, not through forgiveness or acceptance, but through the sheer, exhausting weight of time. The emotional peaks and valleys of his life were leveled into a flat, featureless plain. He no longer had the energy for rage or profound sorrow. Instead, a deep, pervasive melancholy likely set in, a quiet acknowledgement of his fate. He had outlived his era, his enemies, and his own usefulness. He was a living anachronism, and his continued existence was a form of historical record keeping, a body that refused to disintegrate, forcing the system that held him to account for his care until his very last breath. The legend of El Güero, Palma was now entirely separate from the man himself. In the narco corridors, he was forever frozen in his prime, a cunning, powerful, and tragic figure. In the DEA archives, he was a closed case, a success story. In the minds of the new cartel leadership, he was a historical footnote. But in the cold, sterile environment of the Supermax prison, he was just an old, sick man waiting. The dramatic arc of his life had long since concluded. What remained was the epilogue, drawn out over years, a slow and undramatic fading of the light. He had become a testament to the fact that for all the violence, all the money, and all the power, the most formidable enemy is, and always has been, time itself. And time, in the end, is undefeated. Within the profound silence of his confinement, a strange and unexpected form of introspection began to take root in Héctor Palma's consciousness. A slow and involuntary audit of a life lived at the extremes. Devoid of external distractions and the constant life or death demands of his former career, his mind turned inward. Sifting through the ashes of his past, not with the fiery rage of before, but with the weary curiosity of an archivist reviewing documents from a forgotten war. He would have spent countless hours dissecting the pivotal junctions of his life, the forks in the road where a different choice might have led to a different destiny. The young boy from Mocorito, born into a world of limited options, who saw in the illicit trade not just a path to wealth, but a form of empowerment against a system that offered him little. Was there a specific moment, a single decision, that set him irrevocably on this path? Perhaps it was the first time he handled a bale of marijuana, feeling the rough texture and smelling the pungent aroma, understanding its value not as a plant, but as a currency of liberation. Or perhaps it was his first meeting with the young, ambitious Joaquín Guzmán, recognizing in his fierce eyes a kindred spirit, a partner with whom he could scale unimaginable heights. Those early days, filled with the thrill of outsmarting the authorities and the camaraderie of their small crew, might have seemed, in retrospect, like a golden age, a time before the stakes escalated into billions of dollars and the violence became industrial in scale. He would have traced the evolution of his own morality, or rather, its systematic dismantling. The first order he gave that led to a death, not carried out by his own hand, but sanctioned by his word. The initial justification would have been simple: business, necessity, survival. But each subsequent order made the next one easier, until the weight of human life became a negligible factor in a complex equation of profit and power. The memory of his wife, Guadalupe, would have been a constant, painful counterpoint to this descent. She represented the world of light, of normalcy, of love untainted by blood money. He had built a fortress of luxury around her, believing the walls were high enough to keep the darkness out. Now, he understood that the darkness was inside him, and he had carried it into their home every day. The plane crash was not just an attack by rivals or a twist of fate. It was the ultimate consequence of the life he had chosen, a life that made his family a target. This realization was the core of his torment. His love for them was real and profound, yet his actions were the very instrument of their destruction. This paradox was inescapable, a knot that could not be untangled. He may have also reflected on his partnership with Chapo, analyzing it with the cold detachment he once reserved for business plans. Their alliance was a thing of brilliance, a perfect fusion of complementary skills that created a monopoly. But it was also a Faustian bargain. Their success attracted unimaginable enemies, both rival cartels and the combined might of two nations. The very empire they built became a gilded cage, and then a death sentence. The trust they shared was always provisional, tempered by the understanding that in their world, today's partner could be tomorrow's rival. Now, both were entombed in the American prison system, their legacy a trail of corpses and corrupted institutions. Was it worth it? The question, in the absolute silence of his cell, must have echoed with a deafening roar. The billions of dollars were meaningless, numbers on a screen he would never see. The power was an illusion, proven by the fact that he now lived and died at the discretion of a prison warden. The fear he inspired was gone, replaced by the pitying glances of guards. All that remained was the consequence. His life had become a cautionary tale, not just for aspiring criminals, but for anyone who believes that the ends justify the means, that love can be compartmentalized away from sin, and that power can be a substitute for peace. He was a living, breathing lesson in the law of unintended consequences, a man who achieved everything he thought he wanted, only to discover that what he truly desired, a simple, safe life with his family, was the one thing his choices made impossible. In the end, the kingpin was gone. The strategist was obsolete, and all that was left was an old man, alone with his memories, serving a life sentence not just in a prison of concrete and steel, but in the inescapable prison of his own regrets. The relentless march of time within the sterile environment of the Supermax facility began to manifest not just as a psychological weight, but as a tangible physical countdown, measured in the gradual failure of his own body. The robust frame that had once commanded respect and fear in the mountains of Sinaloa was now a fragile vessel, betraying him system by system. The heart, which had raced during narrow escapes and violent confrontations, now beat with an irregular, worrisome rhythm, requiring a cocktail of medications to maintain its basic function. His lungs, which had once breathed the crisp, thin air of the high Sierras, now struggled in the recycled, artificially controlled atmosphere of the prison. The diagnosis of a serious, chronic illness, perhaps congestive heart failure, advanced diabetes, or aggressive cancer, would have been delivered to him with the same clinical detachment as his daily schedule. There were no family members to comfort him, no loved ones to hold his hand during the prognosis. He faced this final enemy alone, with only the rotating shifts of guards and the occasional prison doctor as witnesses to his decline. The medical treatment he received was, by all accounts, competent and within the standard of care for a federal institution, but it was devoid of compassion. He was a high-security patient, and every procedure, no matter how minor, was conducted with restraints and under heavy guard, a constant reminder that his humanity was secondary to his status as a threat. The slow erosion of his physical autonomy was the last and most profound humiliation. The man who had once directed a global logistics network now needed permission and assistance to perform the most basic human functions. This dependency would have been a galling reality for a personality built on control and self-reliance. His world, already shrunk to the size of a cell, now contracted even further to the confines of his own aching body. The past, which had been a source of such tormenting reflection, may have begun to lose its sharpness, its vivid colors fading into a dull, gray monochrome as his cognitive faculties were impacted by age, medication, and the sheer exhaustion of existence. The fiery memory of Guadalupe's smile, the sound of his children's voices, the adrenaline-fueled rush of a successful drug shipment, all these might have become like photographs left out in the sun, their details bleached away, leaving only the faintest impression of what once was. He was losing his past at the same time he was losing his future, trapped in a vanishingly small and painful present. The outside world, with its ongoing cartel wars and political dramas, ceased to have any relevance to him whatsoever. He was no longer a player, a symbol, or even a warning. He was simply a dying man. The bureaucratic machinery of the Bureau of Prisons continued to turn around him, processing his medical requests, updating his file, and ensuring his secure containment until the very end. There were no more legal appeals, no more transfers, no more dramatic turns of events. His story had reached its final, slow-moving act. The legend of El Güero Palma was now completely divorced from the reality of the frail inmate wasting away in a medical unit. In the narco corridos, he was forever frozen in time, a tragic hero of the underworld. In the history books, he was a key figure in the rise of the Sinaloa Cartel. But in the cold, fluorescent light of the prison infirmary, he was patient number, a collection of failing organs, a problem of logistics and security for the state to manage until nature finally took its course. His life had become a study in the absolute power of the state to not only capture and punish, but to contain and erase, to reduce a larger than life figure to a medical chart and a security detail. The immense fortune he had hidden, the loyal soldiers who had once died for him, the political connections he had cultivated, none of it could buy him a moment of genuine comfort or a shred of dignity in his final days. He was dying as he had lived for the past decades alone, in a cage, a world away from the sun drenched lands of his birth. The ultimate price for his empire was not his freedom, which was lost long ago, but this solitary, undignified conclusion, a quiet, anonymous end to a life that had been anything but quiet and anonymous. He was a king dethroned, not by a rival, but by time and decay, his final moments a stark demonstration that every reign, no matter how powerful or terrifying, must eventually come to an end. In the profound solitude of his final days, a silence so absolute it seemed to have its own mass and pressure, Héctor Palma's consciousness drifted in a liminal space between memory, dream, and the stark reality of his decaying physical form. The powerful narcotics administered to manage his pain did not bring sleep so much as a hazy dissociation, where the rigid boundaries of his cell would momentarily dissolve, and he would find himself transported. In these twilight states, he was no longer an old, sick inmate. He was El Güero again, in the prime of his life and power. He would be standing on the tarmac of a clandestine airstrip, the humid night air of Sinaloa thick with the scent of earth and jet fuel, watching his men load kilos of cocaine onto a small plane destined for El Norte. The feeling of control was intoxicating, the quiet hum of a thriving enterprise. In another moment, he was in his garden in Guadalajara, the sound of his children playing nearby, the warmth of Guadalupe's hand in his, a sense of peace so complete it felt like a different universe. These visions were not mere recollections. They were visceral, sensory experiences, more real than the beeping of the medical monitor beside his bed. But they were always fleeting, cruel mirages that would vanish as suddenly as they appeared, yanking him back to the sterile, cold present, to the ache in his bones and the relentless knowledge of his circumstances. This constant shifting between a glorious, vibrant past and a grim, sterile present was a unique form of psychological torture, a final test of a mind that had already endured so much. He would wake from these dreams disoriented, unsure for a moment where he was, the ghost of his wife's perfume or his son's laughter still lingering in the air before being replaced by the scent of antiseptic and industrial cleaner. The medical staff, trained to observe physical signs, would note his vital signs, his respiration, his level of consciousness, but they were blind to the internal journeys he was taking, the final, desperate pilgrimages of a soul preparing to depart. He may have, in his more lucid moments, thought of God or of whatever cosmic force governed the universe. A lifetime of sin and violence does not easily lend itself to a deathbed conversion. But the approach of the great unknown can stir even the most hardened skeptic. Was there a judgment awaiting him? A heaven where he would be reunited with Guadalupe and his children? Or was there only nothingness? An eternal void that mirrored the emptiness of his cell. He had sent countless men to their deaths, but facing his own was a profoundly different and isolating experience. There was no one to absolve him, no priest to hear a final confession, no family member to offer forgiveness. He was alone with his deeds, and the sum total of his life was a heavy, cold weight upon his chest. The bureaucratic process of dying in a supermax prison is as regimented as the process of living in one. protocols were in place. Notifications would be made, but not to grieving loved ones at a bedside. The warden would be informed. The Mexican consulate would be notified, as was their right for a citizen dying in U.S. custody. The FBI and DEA would update their files, officially closing a chapter that had been open for decades. His body, when the time came, would be handled with the same security precautions as the living man. It would be a logistical problem, a matter of storage and transport, of paperwork and legal release. The man who had been a legend was now being reduced to a set of post-mortem procedures. His legacy, which he had once believed would be one of power and respect, was now a complicated, dark stain on history. He was a foundational figure in an organization that had caused incalculable suffering, a key architect of a system of corruption and violence that continued to plague Mexico and the United States. Yet, his personal story of love loss and devastating downfall remained a compelling human tragedy, a reminder that even the most monstrous figures are, at their core, human beings who made catastrophic choices. He was both a perpetrator and a victim, a villain and a tragic hero, depending on the angle from which his story was viewed. But in that sterile room, such distinctions were meaningless. The kingpin, the husband, the father, the prisoner, all these identities were merging, collapsing into the final, universal identity of a dying man. The only sound was the rhythmic hiss of his own breath, a slow metronome counting down the last moments of a life that had been, by any measure, extraordinary in its scope, its drama, and its ultimate devastating cost. The world was about to become a place without Héctor Luis Palma, and in the immense, silent fortress that had been his home for so long. His passing would be as quiet and unnoticed as the turning of a page in a logbook. The final breath of Héctor Luis Palma Salazar was not a dramatic event marked by fanfare or recognition, but a quiet, physiological cessation that occurred within the stark, impersonal confines of the prison infirmary, a solitary exit for a man whose life had been defined by immense sound and fury. There was no deathbed reconciliation, no last-minute revelation, no final whisper of a loved one's name. The end came with the same clinical detachment that had characterized the last decades of his existence. A flat line on a heart monitor, noted by a guard or a nurse during a routine check, triggering a standard operating procedure for inmate mortality. The official time of death was logged, the warden was informed, and the meticulous machinery of the state swung into action to process his remains. His body, the same body that had once strode through the world as a king, was now a piece of evidence, a biohazard, a problem of jurisdiction and disposal. It was likely transported under guard to a local medical examiner's office for an autopsy, a mandatory procedure for all inmate deaths, where it was subjected to one final, invasive examination, its secrets laid bare on a cold steel table. The causes of death, cardiac arrest, respiratory failure, organ shutdown, were listed on a form, the culmination of a long, slow decline. The news of his passing, when it was eventually released to the public, was met not with the massive outcry that might have accompanied it 30 years prior. but with a muted, historical curiosity. Major news outlets ran brief obituaries, summarizing his life in a few paragraphs. So founder of the Sinaloa Cartel, partner of El Chapo, deed in U.S. custody. For a new generation, it was a history lesson. For the law enforcement officials who had pursued him, it was the closing of a very old file. For the communities ravaged by the drug trade, it was a footnote, a single name in a long list of those responsible for an ongoing tragedy. There were no mass gatherings of mourners in Culiacan, no grandiose narco funerals with brass bands and flower-laden processions. His death was as quiet and anonymous as his imprisonment had been. The question of his burial was a complex one. With no immediate family to claim his body, his wife and children long dead, any extended relatives likely fearful of the association, his remains became the responsibility of the state. He was likely buried in an unmarked grave in a potter's field near the prison, or his ashes were stored in a nondescript container on a shelf, a final, ignominious resting place for a man who had once commanded a private army and amassed a fortune. The contrast between the power he wielded and the anonymity of his end could not have been more stark. It was the ultimate demonstration of the transience of earthly power. The billions of dollars, the private jets, the sprawling ranches, the fear he inspired, none of it could follow him beyond the grave. In death, he was equal to the poorest, most forgotten soul, returned to the earth without ceremony or remembrance. His legacy, however, is a more complicated and enduring thing. The Sinaloa Cartel, the organization he helped build from the ground up, survived him. It adapted, fractured, and evolved, but it remained a dominant force in the global drug trade, a testament to the robust and ruthless business model he and Guzmán perfected, the routes he established, the corruption networks he nurtured, the template for a decentralized, franchise-like criminal corporation. These were his true, lasting monuments. And they continued to pump poison and violence into the world long after his own heart had stopped. He became a permanent part of the dark mythology of the drug war, a name that would forever be linked to a specific era of its history, a cautionary tale about the heights of power and the depths of downfall. The story of Héctor Palma is the story of the American dream in its most twisted, inverted form, a tale of immense ambition and entrepreneurial spirit channeled into the creation of a criminal empire, leading to spectacular success and then to a catastrophic, total collapse. It is a story that forces us to consider the nature of power, the price of love, and the inescapable gravity of consequences. He lived a life of Shakespearean proportions, a tragic hero whose fatal flaw was his own ambition, and whose downfall was sealed not just by his enemies, but by a single, devastating personal loss that shattered his soul and set him on a path of self-destruction. In the end, he was not killed by a rival's bullet or a government operation, but by the slow, inexorable passage of time within a cage of his own making, a final, fitting end for a man who learned too late that the walls of every prison, both physical and psychological, are built from the choices we make in the name of power. In the years that followed the quiet passing of Héctor Palma, his story did not simply vanish into the historical record, but instead underwent a gradual process of crystallization, transforming from a current event into a defined chapter in the sprawling, dark epic of the international drug trade. The world he left behind continued its chaotic spin, largely indifferent to the death of one of its oldest architects. The Sinaloa Cartel, now a Hydra-headed entity, faced internal power struggles following the extradition of its other iconic leader, Joaquín, El Chapo, Guzmán, and the relentless pressure from the CJNG. The violence in Mexico reached new, horrifying peaks with mass graves, drone attacks, and a level of brutality that made the cartel wars of Palma's era seem almost conventional. Yet, the foundational strategies he helped implement, the sophisticated trafficking routes, the corruption of high-level officials, the focus on controlling key plazas, remained the operational bedrock for not just Sinaloa, but for all major cartels. His legacy, therefore, was not in the continued use of his name, but in the enduring efficiency of his methods. In a strange, posthumous validation, the business model he co-authored proved to be remarkably resilient, outliving its creators and adapting to new geopolitical realities. For historians and journalists, Palma's life became a rich case study. Academics pored over declassified documents and trial transcripts, analyzing his rise and fall to understand the socio-economic conditions that breed such powerful criminal entities. They debated the pivotal role of the plane crash, not as a mere personal tragedy, but as a critical juncture that altered the trajectory of the Sinaloa Cartel, removing its more strategic and calculating co-founder and leaving the more impulsively ambitious Guzmán in unchallenged control. This event was seen as a turning point that may have escalated the organization's violence and its war with the Tijuana cartel. Biographers sought to piece together the human being behind the myth, attempting to understand the complex interplay between the loving family man and the ruthless drug lord. They analyzed his psychology, speculating on how the compartmentalization of his life ultimately led to its destruction. The narrative of Héctor Palma became a cautionary tale about the impossibility of separating a criminal enterprise from one's personal life, no matter how high the walls are built. In popular culture, his figure was romanticized and simplified. He appeared as a character in television series and documentaries, often portrayed as the quieter, smarter partner to El Chapo's more flamboyant persona. Narco corridos continued to immortalize him, their lyrics focusing on his power, his tragedy, and his defiance, glossing over the brutal reality of his actions and their consequences. In these ballads, he was El Güero, a legendary figure, a man of respect who loved his family and faced his downfall with courage. This sanitized version stood in stark contrast to the reality of the frail, broken man who died alone in a supermax prison. The dissonance between the myth and the man was a testament to the power of storytelling to reshape history, to transform a deeply flawed and destructive individual into a symbol of a certain kind of ambitious, albeit misguided masculinity. For the people of Sinaloa, his story was a part of the local folklore, a reminder of a time when a handful of men from humble origins defied the odds and built empires for better or worse. He was a symbol of both the potential for immense wealth and the inevitability of a violent end, a narrative that both attracted and repelled the youth of the region. His life served as a dark roadmap, illustrating a path to unimaginable riches that was paved with blood and almost guaranteed to end in prison or a grave. The location of his remains, likely in an unmarked plot on American soil, became a subject of minor speculation. Was there a secret grave somewhere in the Sinaloa Mountains, visited by a few loyalists? Or were his ashes scattered in a place known only to a trusted few? The mystery surrounding his final resting place added one last layer of obscurity to his story, ensuring that the physical man was as elusive in death as he had been in the final years of his life. Héctor Palma had become entirely a story, a collection of facts, myths, and analyses, his humanity subsumed by his legacy. The man was gone, but the shadow he cast was long, a permanent part of the landscape of a conflict that showed no signs of abating, a ghost whose choices continued to echo in the violence of a new generation. The enduring fascination with the life and downfall of Héctor Palma stems from its archetypal resonance, a narrative that taps into universal themes of ambition, power, love, and retribution that have captivated humanity since the days of Greek tragedy. His story is not merely a chronicle of a criminal's life. It is a modern-day parable about the corrupting nature of absolute power and the inescapable web of cause and effect. At its core, it is the tale of a man who, starting from nothing, dared to reach for the stars, only to have the universe itself seemingly conspire to tear everything from his grasp. The initial rise, the period of his partnership with Guzmán, represents the classic hero's journey into a world of adventure and danger, where his unique skills, his calm demeanor, his strategic mind, his ability to build alliances are honed and rewarded with immense wealth and influence. He becomes a king, a ruler of a shadow nation, commanding respect and fear in equal measure. This is the part of the story that fuels the narco corridos and the romantic legends, the fantasy of the underdog who beats the system, but the heart of the tragedy, the element that elevates it beyond a simple crime story, is the profound love he held for his family. Guadalupe and his children were not just accessories to his life of crime, they were his sanctuary, his moral compass, the one part of his existence that remained pure and uncorrupted. This love was his greatest strength, but in the context of his chosen profession, it became his most devastating vulnerability. The plane crash is the peripeteia, the sudden reversal of fortune that is a hallmark of all great tragedies. It is the moment the gods, or fate, or simply the brutal logic of the world he inhabited strike him down. This loss is so catastrophic, so personally annihilating, that it shatters the man and fundamentally alters the trajectory of the narrative. The hero becomes the vengeful, broken king, his judgment clouded by grief, his actions becoming increasingly reckless and driven by emotion rather than strategy. This descent is a critical component of the tragedy. We watch a master strategist become a pawn of his own pain, making the fatal errors that lead to his capture. His incarceration is not the end of the story, but the beginning of the long, slow denouement, the unraveling of his spirit. The American supermax prison represents the ultimate isolation, a modern version of being chained to a rock, forced to endure an eternity of reflection and regret. Here, the themes of the story culminate. The power he sought has become utterly meaningless. The wealth is a phantom. The love that defined him is a memory that now brings more pain than comfort. He is reduced to his most essential state, a man alone with the consequences of his choices. The final act of his life, his physical decline and death, is the catharsis. It is not a joyful release, but a somber, quiet conclusion that allows the audience, the listener of this story, to reflect on the journey and its meaning. The ultimate lesson of Héctor Palma's life is not that crime does not pay on a material level. For a time, it paid immensely. The lesson is far more profound. That a life built on a foundation of violence and corruption cannot sustain true happiness or love, and that the pursuit of power at all costs ultimately leads to the most profound powerlessness. His story forces us to confront the seductive nature of the dark path, the allure of bypassing society's rules to seize one's destiny. But it also serves as a grim reminder of the price tag attached to that path, a price that is ultimately paid not in currency, but in soul, in love, and in the very essence of one's humanity. He is a figure who commands a strange mix of revulsion and pity. We revile the drug lord responsible for so much suffering, but we cannot help but pity the man who lost everything he held dear and died alone in a cage. This duality is what makes his story so compelling and so timeless. It is a narrative that holds a dark mirror up to our own ambitions and asks us what we are willing to sacrifice for them, and whether any amount of power or wealth is worth the cost of one's soul, one's love, and one's freedom. The echo of Héctor Güero Palma is not the echo of a gunshot or the roar of a plane, but the silent, haunting question he leaves behind: was it worth it? And in the quiet that follows the end of his tale, the only answer is the one we find in our own hearts. The final, enduring image of Héctor Palma's life is not one of a powerful kingpin in his prime, nor of a grieving husband at a smoldering crash site, but of a profound and unsettling silence that stretches from his solitary cell in Colorado all the way back to the sun-baked hills of Sinaloa. This silence is the true legacy of his journey, a void that speaks louder than any narco-corrido or courtroom testimony ever could. It is the silence of a name that is no longer spoken with fear or reverence in the corridors of power, but is instead mentioned in the past tense in history books. It is the silence of the unmarked grave, the final, anonymous resting place that stands in stark opposition to the grandiose monuments and lavish estates he once owned. It is the silence that followed the flat line on his heart monitor, a sound that went unnoticed by the world he once influenced so dramatically. This silence serves as the ultimate verdict on a life of noise and violence, a poetic justice that underscores the ephemeral nature of all earthly power. The empire he built, The Sinaloa Cartel continues its operations, but it does so as a faceless corporation. Its current leaders careful to avoid the cult of personality that ultimately doomed its founders. The name, El Güero, has been stripped of its power, becoming a historical footnote, a name for trivia questions about the drug war. For the people of Mexico, and particularly of Sinaloa, his story is woven into the complex cultural fabric, a reminder of a path that leads to both unimaginable wealth and unimaginable loss. It is a narrative that parents might use to warn their children, a tale that simultaneously glamorizes and demonizes the narco lifestyle, embodying the deep-seated ambivalence that many communities feel toward the cartels that are both their scourge and, in some cases, their only source of economic opportunity. The silence also hangs over the American justice system, which, in its cold, efficient way, achieved its goal. It did not just imprison Héctor Palma, it erased him. It systematically dismantled his legend, neutralized his threat, and reduced him to a number, a file, and then to a corpse. His case is held up as a success story, a testament to the power of persistent, cross-border law enforcement cooperation. Yet, the silence he left behind was quickly filled by others. New cartels emerged, new kingpins rose, and the flow of drugs continued unabated, proving that the problem was systemic, far larger than any single individual. The war was not won with his capture or his death. It merely entered a new, more complex phase. For us, the audience to this saga, the silence that follows his story is an invitation to reflect. It asks us to consider the nature of justice, of punishment, and of redemption. Was his life sentence in a supermax prison a form of living death, a just punishment for his crimes? Or was the true punishment the personal hell he endured after the loss of his family, a torment that no court could ever sentence him to? The story resists easy moralizing. It presents us with a complex, flawed human being who made monstrous choices and suffered catastrophic consequences, both deserved and undeserved. We are left not with a clear hero or villain, but with a deeply human tragedy that challenges our notions of good and evil. The silence of his end is a reminder of our own mortality, a memento mori that whispers that all reigns must end, all power must fade, and all stories, no matter how grand or terrible, must eventually conclude. The mountains of Sinaloa, which witnessed his beginning, remain silent and eternal, as do the institutions that witnessed his end. Héctor Palma was a temporary disturbance in their long history, a violent storm that passed, leaving behind a lesson etched not in stone, but in the quiet understanding that the pursuit of power at the expense of humanity leads, inevitably, to the most profound and lasting silence of all. And so, we arrive at the end of our journey, a journey that began in the rugged promise of the Sinaloa Mountains and concluded in the sterile silence of a supermax tome, a trajectory that traces the full, devastating arc of a life lived at the violent extremes of human ambition. The story of Héctor Luis Palma Salazar is now complete, a closed book on a shelf of history, its pages filled with tales of unimaginable power, profound love, catastrophic loss, and ultimate downfall. We have walked with him from his humble origins, through the daring early days of building an empire, to the golden era of his reign alongside Joaquín Guzmán, a period where it seemed they had truly conquered their world. We witnessed the creation of his sanctuary, the loving family that was the core of his being, and we stood beside him in spirit at the smoldering wreckage that destroyed it, an event that forever scarred his soul and set him on a path of self-immolating vengeance. We followed him into the shadows of his grief-stricken war, watched as the walls closed in, and observed his final capture, the end of his freedom and the beginning of his long, slow erasure. We traversed the legal labyrinths of extradition and stood with him in the cold, impersonal American courtroom where he faced the consequences of his life's work. We endured with him the profound isolation of a supermax prison, a psychological void where he was forced to confront the ghosts of his past and the emptiness of his legacy. And finally, we bore witness to his quiet, anonymous end, a death as undramatic as his life had been dramatic, a final whisper in a story that had been written in shouts and gunfire. This narrative, pieced together from countless sources, as our initial disclaimer stated, was presented with the sole purpose of bringing this complex and significant chapter of modern history to life for you, the listener. It was a story not of glorification, but of understanding, an attempt to comprehend the machinery of power, the fragility of the human heart, and the inescapable gravity of our choices. The rise and fall of Héctor Palma serves as a permanent cautionary tale, a dark star in the constellation of human endeavors, reminding us that the pursuit of power without conscience is a Faustian bargain that ultimately demands payment in the currency of the soul. His life asks us difficult questions about the societies that create such figures and the systems that struggle to contain them. It challenges us to look beyond the simplistic labels of good and evil, and to see the tragic, broken humanity that exists even in the most formidable of monsters. As this story concludes, we are left not with answers, but with reflections on love, on loss, on power, and on the silent, enduring weight of consequence. The tale of El Güero is over, but its echoes will remain, a somber melody in the long, ongoing symphony of human ambition and folly. Thank you for listening, for allowing this voice to guide you through the shadows of this remarkable and tragic life. If this journey into the heart of a dark legacy has been engaging, if it has offered you a perspective you hadn't considered before, then the purpose of this narrative has been fulfilled. I encourage you to share your thoughts in the comments below. Let us know what part of this saga resonated most deeply with you. And if you wish to continue exploring the intricate and often hidden stories that shape our world, please make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next deep dive into the forgotten corners of history. The story of Héctor Palma has ended, but many more stories are waiting to be told. Thank you once again, and until next time.